Hello, and in today's videos we'll be discussing the disadvantages of the scientific method. This is page 55 in your textbook. Now, in today's video we'll be discussing the disadvantages of the scientific method. So for us, this is going to be a continuation of the discussion of the scientific method in which we started in the previous video when we were discussing the advantages of the scientific method. Now, this is still PY3, and this is a possible question that can come up for the issues questions. Now, before we can get too much into the content for the essay, we need to actually have a definition of what a disadvantage is. So, a disadvantage is an unfavourable circumstance, situation, thing or person. In this case, how using the scientific approach can have a disadvantage or handicap psychological research. So how it can have a negative impact on the practice of psychology using these scientific methods. Now, like the other essay, the main tip here to get into the higher marks is that you need to use examples of research and psychological evidence to support your argument, which we will continuously do throughout today's lesson. Now, so what you need to do is identify and state what the disadvantage is, and remember to give specific examples for the psychological research to support your example or argument. So therefore it's becoming more wholesome in its regards. Now, before we can really get too far into this essay, we need to understand several key terms. We've got internal validity. So obviously this can be impacted by demand characteristics and practice effects. So this is the effects observed are accurate and are caused wholly by the manipulation of the independent variable. So therefore we can obviously conclude if demand characteristics or practice effects have started to impact the research, we know it's no longer the independent variable that is rendering those results. Whilst external validity is the extent to which any findings can be generalised to any population or setting in the real world. So this will obviously render low ecological validity if it cannot be applied to the real world. Reductionist, obviously reducing complex behaviours down to simplistic terms. When it ignores individual differences, so we're ignoring the impacts age, gender, sex, etc. can really have on the research. So when we conduct research that only uses one specific group, we generalise results but truly ignore the impact that this can have and the impact that other ethnicities or subgroups may have on the results. And then obviously we have ethical problems such as deception or psychological or physical harm. Now, as I have just discussed it, throughout the whole of this video, that is how it is going to be discussed. So we're going to follow the key terms in order, and you can obviously try to replicate this in terms of your essay. Now, this is the introduction for the disadvantage of the scientific method essay question. So, what does the scientific method offer us? Obviously, it offers a controlled setting in which we can test behaviour which may not be possible in the real world, which is the main benefit. We can develop these artificial settings as a result. Why is this benefit for psychology, and what could we not make if we didn't use scientific methods? It produces controlled research that can be replicated and ensures that objectivity and predictability is high. Without this, we can never make a cause and effect statement. So we can never say definitively because A happens, B will be a result. Now, could there be a problem using the scientific method to investigate all types of human behaviour? The disadvantage for psychology in using scientific methods have often been highlighted, with some suggesting that there are areas of psychology that are inappropriate for using these scientific methods. And therefore this raises serious implications for how justified it is to generalise these certain findings when they are inappropriate for the type of behaviour we are observing or trying to measure. So there are various problems with this, and we are going to discuss this further within the essay. Now, before we go any further, this is just a quick little recap of validity. So validity is, have we measured what we intended to measure? And in the essay, we are going to be addressing the lack of internal validity and the lack of external validity, definitions in which I've already given to you on the previous slide. So when it comes around to the disadvantage of the scientific method, we talk about it lacks internal validity, that other behaviour other actions are causing the behaviour rather than the manipulation of the independent variable. So the three main ones that we identify is investigator effects, the behaviour as a result of the investigator's manipulation or involvement, be that through verbal or non-verbal manipulation, and demand characteristics. So now the participants are aware of the aim of the study and they try to please the researcher by meeting those aims of the study as well. The third one, which we will discuss, is evaluation apprehension. So participants are apprehensive about being judged, and this may affect the results. So they don't want to be a failure or be classified as a failure, so therefore they're apprehensive about being judged in itself, so which in turn could ensure that their behaviour will be modified. So why is this an issue? Obviously for us, this means that we're not measuring true behaviour as a result. It is not information which we can generally apply to real life as a result of this. And our example for this is Langer and Rodin, who could argue that people's well-being improved due to the investigator effects. So the fact that the nurses were just being there and taking an interest in that particular group. So this in turn could have enhanced the effects of the responsibility given to the rig group, rather than it just being the fact that they've got greater responsibility. It could be the interest shown by the nurses that has had that greater impact on their well-being. Now, another disadvantage that we look at is it lacks external validity. So the fact that it cannot be applied to other settings. Now, for us, this is due to investigator effects and participant effects. The participant effect is, this is not the same as investigator effects. Participants react to cues in the experimental environment, which in turn affects the validity of the experiment. And obviously the research situation we've got to take into account as well. So we've got to look at mundane realism when an artificial situation closely resembles real life situation. However, sometimes when the tasks are given, they are not replicable or seen within real life. So therefore, obviously it would lack mundane realism as well. We have experimental realism as well, when participants are fooled into believing that an artificial setup is real, when obviously in the real world this would not be the case. Now, why is this a disadvantage? So the generalisability of the findings is questioned, as we are unable to apply these findings to other settings. So it may lack ecological validity, because we can't apply it to that real world. It may lack population validity due to maybe a sample bias, or the fact that it's not an actual representative sample that's being used. It may just be all males present within the experiment. As well as that, it may lack historical validity, so that we might say it's a child of its time and it cannot be replicated in other periods. Now, what lacks mundane realism? So the example which you remember from AS is ASH in 1951. The study, we don't all generally conform when looking at lines on a board and judging their length. This is a task we wouldn't normally do in real life. It's abstract, so therefore this is why it lacks mundane realism as a result. Okay, the main example that we will use in our essay is actually Loftus and Palmer. Now, Loftus and Palmer is interesting because obviously their experiment was conducted within a lab environment. They found that leading questions do influence the eyewitness testimony, but really, is this reflected in real life? In reality, consequences of the eyewitness testimony, there will be consequences for this testimony, so it can impact an individual's life. But when we're looking at a lab environment, this isn't the case. It is abstract in nature. Ewell and Cutshall here actually support this idea within their research. And obviously within their research they found even with the presence of leading questions, eyewitness testimony didn't falter. So this meant that Loftus and Palmer does actually lack ecological validity as a result, furthermore highlighting the issue that psychology has in using the scientific method when investigating real-life behaviour, because truly, is this a replication of the behaviour that we'll see in real life? Now, the next area that we'll be looking at is reductionism. So reductionism is reducing complex behaviours down into simple explanations. And this is seen through the use of observations. So obviously we know with the scientific method, it uses a plethora of methods within this artificial environment. So observations is one. The disadvantage, because you're using observations, is the operationalisation of the behaviour. So defining the DV, as it were. So we can measure it effectively and make it more concrete. With observations, this can obviously ensure that it's oversimplified. So the behaviour that we're looking for may not be as rich or as detailed if we were just freely noting it down, which in turn decreases the internal validity of the research. Now, this is just the example of reductionism here when we're looking at Bandura, because Bandura used a behaviour checklist to note down and take note of any behaviour that was seen. Obviously, you can see here, this is all that the observer would be looking at, and this is the only behaviour the observer would be noting down as well. So why is this an issue? It is obviously oversimplifying a very complex behaviour, such as aggression. Now, Bandura had to operationalise aggression into these categories for the Bobodal observation through the use of that behaviour checklist that we've just seen. So, meaning he reduced that complex behaviour. So, really, it throws into the question that actually what he was rendering, was this truly a valid measure of aggression? In fact, it possibly wasn't, because there might have been other behaviours which were not noted down, which may be more significant as a result. Now, the main criticism here that we're going to be moving on to is it ignores individual differences, which means it's nomothetic in nature. So the disadvantages are because it ignores the factors such as age and gender and the implications it can have on the research. Because when we have a sample or a small sample, we then generalise our results to the wider population. When in fact, if our target sample were just all male, we cannot assume that this can be applied to females as well. Now, obviously for us, in terms of ignoring individual differences, we can see this with Ash. So Ash used all male, all American university undergraduates as his participants, and then he generalised the results to the wider population, ignoring the possibility that this group of people that he used within his target sample may have unique characteristics which differ from the wider population as a result. So therefore, it's nomothetic in its approach. It's ignoring those individual differences which exist within the society. Now, as we should be aware by now, with the BPS, they outline that participants should leave in the same state in which they entered the psychological research. Now, we know that this is a key feature within the terms of ethical discussions. However, we know with experiments this often isn't the case. Participants have left experiments obviously encountering psychological or physical harm as a result of it. So why is this as disadvantages? Because participants have the right to be treated as colleagues and equal rather than just objects within a piece of research. So psychologists have a moral and professional obligation to ensure that these participants are treated well as a result. Now, there's no real shock as to who we'll be using as our example here, and our example is Milgram. So there were obvious signs of distress with these participants in the study, and they had long-lasting psychological effects. Although he had previously tried to conduct this to the ethical guidelines and seemingly has followed them, he ignored the impact that this lab setting and the tasks that he made his participants undergo and the effects that it had on their well-being. Now, most experiments use deception as a tool, but this is an ethical issue in itself, and this could lead to greater ethical issues such as, obviously again, psychological or physical harm. So when it comes around to this discussion, they ignore the effects of their research, and they ignore the impacts of these ethical issues. So the fact that we are deceiving someone could lead to further damage to the individual. So therefore we are violating the guidelines which are outlined by the BPS. They are not leaving in the same state in which they entered the research, because they would have been altered by their experience in that particular environment.